Cambridge in the last month of the summer term, the season of college and university exams, so the lawns behind King's College Chapel were practically empty. But I had business to discuss. I was just back from a Land Rover journey across Asia, and my brother, the one in the gown, managed to snatch a couple of hours to talk over plans we had for another expedition. This too was to be a Land Rover journey, but on the other side of the world, as far from England to the west as the other trip had been to the east. Like our London to Singapore trek, it was to be a joint Oxford and Cambridge effort. The territory? South America. Quite a lot to discuss, as you can imagine. But our Asian experience naturally made the planning a little easier. Here's the itinerary we planned, starting at the top of South America on a long circuit that would take us through the cattle lands of British Guiana, into the wild country of the Rio Branco territory, down the river system of the Amazon, and eventually right across and around the continent back to the northern coast. A few months later, a Norwegian ship was carrying us and our equipment towards the coast of British Guiana. 7 men, 50 crates of equipment, 3 Land Rovers, and a cat stowaway. 7 men with a full program ahead. To make botanical collections for Kew Gardens and other bodies along the savanna jungle border north and south of the Amazon basin. To gather information for a book on the Indians of the Mato Grosso. And to collect material for newspaper articles, television films, and of course this film you're looking at. Georgetown, capital of British Guiana, was our starting point. From the moment we docked, our expedition had really begun. Georgetown is tiny for a capital. Wooden bungalows and old colonial streets, many of which started life under the Dutch as canals. Here we stocked up with 75 gallons of petrol per vehicle, for the next pump was a long, long way ahead. Then we drove to a sugar estate that was to be our temporary base camp. We made camp, and now, at last, we were on our own. Our botanist wandered down to the riverbank for his first close look at the continent of South America. And for South America's first look at him. Meanwhile, I took off by air to reconnoiter our route into the interior. I found that after a narrow farming belt, our only chance was along a cattle trail that wound its way southwards between scrub and rainforest. And a couple of days later, we were on the trail ourselves, motoring over thick, gritty sand through dirty bushland. Each Land Rover was loaded up to capacity, but apart from the extra fuel tanks and the winch and brush guard in front, they were standard vehicles. To begin with, going was fair, and we were pleased with our progress. But gradually, the track petered out and finally became lost among loose white sand and rock-strewn swamps. Some days, every foot gained was counted as a victory, with the cars being winched further than they were driven and their wheels disappearing in mud or sand. Overall, we found ourselves averaging 6 or 7 miles a day. In some places, it was easier to force a way through the virgin bush rather than try battling forward up the rain-eroded trail. There were no people or villages to be seen, for the trail had originally been cut through uninhabited jungle to get cattle from the inland plains down to the coast. But every day or two, we would come out of the forest onto an open paddock that had been cleared and planted with grass for the cattle to feed on during their long journey. And after each paddock, back into the brush again. By the time 3 weeks and all our food supplies had gone, we reached the open Ropuni savannas. Here, 3 centuries ago, Sir Walter Raleigh looked in vain for the legendary city of El Dorado. In fact, there are no cities on this plateau even now, just lonely cattle stations like this, run by Harry Turner and his wife. Lonely, but huge. They have 25,000 head of cattle on a concession of more than 2,000 square miles of grassland, the second biggest open range ranch in the world. Dadawana, as the ranch is called, has its problems. Some 400 head of cattle a year end up as food for vultures. They die of paralytic rabies carried by the vampire bat, which sucks their blood at night. The Turners were trying out a new experimental vaccine against the disease while we were there. The soil is poor and the cows can't be milked. The steers are only rounded up once a year, and their value so low that just across the border, we were offered 4,000 head in exchange for a single Land Rover. There was nothing much we could do with 4,000 head, except eat them one by one, so we decided to stick to our cars. We were soon pushing on towards the Kanaku Mountains, where we were to make our first botanical survey. The local Makushi Indians say the world's best poison for darts and arrows can be found around here, but we were just looking for a campsite. This open space looked just about right, so we made it our home for the next 2 months. The local tribesmen came to call it Mr. White Man's Sit-Down Place. Our cook had once kept a pub in England, and he woke the camp every morning by bashing a can and bellowing, "Time, gentlemen, please." Breakfast was porridge, sprinkled with ants and wood ash. Lunch and dinner, as often as not, were porridge again, with the same dressing. So we didn't linger over meals, but got them over quickly and pushed ahead with the day's work. In the hour after dawn, there would be great flocks of duck and egret on the lakes, and the cool of these tropical mornings was our botanist's favorite time for collecting specimens. This is the muka muka plant, which has a beautiful chalice-like flower at its tip. But not everything about camp life was beautiful, and even some of the beautiful things could be annoying. Hummingbirds, for instance, make a noise rather like a man snoring while they suck at flowers. It's as irritating and effective as an alarm clock. The plants we collected were put in porous paper to preserve them for classification and research in England. Other members of the party studied the local birds and animals. They searched for a week to find the nest of a jaraboo stork. They located one at last on an outcrop of rock, steep but climbable. The jaraboo stork is one of the biggest birds in the world, with a wingspan of 14 feet, nearly half the size of a wartime Spitfire, though fortunately not so dangerous. The nest contained a young fledgling who didn't seem too worried by visitors smaller than his parents. This giant baby looked very strange without his full feathers, rather like the prehistoric pterodactyls, which in Conan Doyle's novel The Lost World occupied a mysterious mountain in the wilds of South America. Actually, the original of this mountain was just around the corner, as distances go in these parts, and a month later, some of us were marching towards it. It is Roraima, mother of rivers, a sheer block of sandstone capped with cloud. Its cliffs are the biggest in the world, and when it was discovered less than 100 years ago, explorers said the flat summit must have been isolated since prehistoric times. That gave Conan Doyle his idea. For 20 or 30 years, it was possible to believe that strange, obsolete monsters might live on this mountainous, lost world. But in 1886, a narrow path was discovered, slanting up the cliff face. It was by this path that we made our ascent. It was icy cold up there, and by the time we reached the summit, the whole tableland was swirling in mist. We gathered some wood to make a fire in a cave. An eerie, uneasy night. Thousands of years of wind and rain had worn the rocks into shapes rather like Conan Doyle's monsters. But in fact, there was little life, a few butterflies and small frogs that did not jump, but rolled. We found that most of the rain drained through a crevasse in the center of the plateau and spouted out in waterfalls lower down the cliff face. Stanley wanted to investigate the waterfalls. Unfortunately, as he was climbing, he slipped on a belay and fractured his foot. This was rather worrying because we were a long way from any help. When we eventually brought him out, we found his ankle swelling, and it took 10 hours of hopping and crawling to get him down to our camp in the foothills. John, the third of our party, went off for help while I stayed to look after Stanley. For days, we watched for the smoke signals in the valley that would mean John and his Indians were coming to our rescue. At last, we saw them on the day our food ran out, and they weren't very far away. Stanley lit a fire in reply. The Indians brought horses, and though it was still a week's traveling to an airstrip where a bush plane could reach us, our troubles were more or less over. A month later, we had rejoined the main party and were taking our Land Rovers across the border of British Guiana into Brazil. We reached a frontier cow town where it seemed the women did the work and the men supervised. The local spirit, cachaca, is so potent you can drink yourself unconscious for threepence. A tributary of the Amazon was to take us on the next stage of our journey. the locals gathered to watch us get our equipment aboard. A cattle barge isn't really designed to carry Land Rovers, and I think they hoped one of our cars would fall in. There was no animosity about it. Would have just made a change from drinking kachaka. But I'm afraid we disappointed them. The loading was successful. The next week was a lazy one, as our line of barges floated downstream towards the Amazon itself. We had time to catch up with our letters, our reports about the expedition so far, and our reading, mostly about other expeditions. And we cleaned the cars, which had stood up remarkably well. On the other side of the Amazon basin, we started traveling down the northeast coast of Brazil. We passed construction sites where great dams and hydroelectric projects were going up as part of Brazil's development program. It should make a big difference to this part of the country, which, away from the construction sites, is an empty, arid territory, hundreds of miles of wilderness on each side of the road. But in spite of their heavy load and the very rough and bumpy surface, our Land Rovers averaged 50 miles an hour for a dozen hours a day. At that pace, it didn't take us long to reach Rio de Janeiro, which for 2 centuries, until April 1960, was the capital of Brazil. An impressive situation, with the city and its bay framed in huge mountain peaks, and a big change from the traveling conditions we'd become used to, though just as perilous in its own way. In fact, we collected more dents driving through Brazilian towns than we did in the roughest open country. On the whole, we were happier out in the open. Though even here, far from any town, you could come across traffic problems in the shape of herds of cattle. This is the road that runs 1,000 miles into the interior from the old capital of Rio to the new one of Brasilia. It runs through remote backlands where cattle ranching is the principal business. The Brasilia project aroused a great deal of political controversy. And as we drove our little convoy of Land Rovers into the outskirts of the brand new capital, we passed placards announcing firmly that everyone would benefit from its inauguration. Whatever the internal debate, Brasilia was certainly growing in front of our eyes. A courageous experiment for a great country to build a new capital city from scratch on the edge of the jungle. Brazil plans to conquer and cultivate the forest, and Brasilia is the symbol of that determination. A few weeks later, we ourselves were traveling towards the heart of that forest. We were making for the North Mato Grosso, an immense tract of uncharted jungle where the British explorer Colonel P.W. Fawcett disappeared in 1925. He was almost certainly killed by Indians, and some of the tribes still fight to keep the pioneers out of their land. Parts of the Mato Grosso are impassable for vehicles, even Land Rovers, and finally we had to go ahead on foot. Some of the first Indians we met were Xukahami, a primitive and warlike tribe who distend their lips with 6-inch wooden discs and eat earth as a regular part of their diet. Other tribes have more conventional foods. These women and boys are carrying sugarcane to be ground in a homemade crusher, which Brazilian officers of the Indian Protection Service have shown them how to build. The Brazilians are trying to graft modern techniques gradually onto the foundations of Indian life. But there are still villages comparatively unaffected by civilization, and they suggested we should visit one of them. It belonged to a tribe of the Xinguana group, which probably killed Colonel Fawcett, and their way of life is still much as it was thousands of years ago. But they must have grown used to strangers. There was no sign of hostility when we arrived. When a warrior visits a village, etiquette demands that he fight every man in the tribe. The custom is still observed, though more or less harmlessly. We found that traditional ceremony continues to play a major part in the life of the tribe. A dead chief is buried under the square of logs in the center, and this is the dance of the dead. Tribal religion was the moral cement of their way of life, and its abandonment on contact with civilization before that way of life had developed into something higher has often led to the moral decay of these simple and vulnerable people. But in this particular group, the ancient customs are undisturbed. These girls, for instance, are on their way to the initiation hut, where they will remain out of sight for their year of puberty. A primitive society, but it works. And you can't transplant a tree to richer soil by simply tearing up its roots. From the Indians to the Andes. Our time was running out, and we traveled fast, right across South America and through the Atacama Desert, and then headed for the high mountain plateau where the Incas built their cities many hundreds of years ago. We had nearly finished our 36,000-mile journey through this vast and varied continent, and we had achieved a great deal more than mileage. Apart from expanding our own horizons, we had been able to add to the sum of knowledge about remote areas of South America, areas in which there is still a tremendous amount to be learned, as we realized once again when we stopped to look at the ruins of the great Inca fort of Sacsayhuaman. The gaps will only be filled, little by little, by expeditions such as ours. Some of the things we found out were material for specialists. Some of them, many of them, deserve a wider audience. But all of them were well worth the seeking.